The suits we wore into Hollowspan had a 40-minute air reserve, and I learned to do my counting in batches that fit inside it, because if you stopped mid-row to grieve, you ran out of air before you ran out of names. I was a reclamation engineer. Before the test, that meant scrap and salvage. After, it meant walking grid lines through a dead settlement with a counter clicking against my hip and a sample case on my back, because somebody had to bring back what the Kallow Ascendancy had used on us, and I was the one who knew how to lift a thing without breaking it. The Cinder Draught didn't look like much in the canister. A pale amber residue, settled in low ground the way frost settles, except it didn't melt and it didn't blow off in wind. It sat on Hollowspan streets for 6 days before our drones could even get close enough to read it, and by then there was nothing left in the settlement that the suits needed to protect us from except the silence. 4012. That was the final count, the one I signed off on personally, row by row, name by name, cross-checked against the colony register twice because the first total felt wrong in my hands, too clean, too round before I shaved it down to the real number. Hollowspan had no military value. No relay station, no shipyard, no border garrison worth the word. It had a grain depot and a school and a clinic with 11 beds. The Kallow's own intercepted logs called it an unshielded baseline population, suitable for dispersal efficacy measurement. They had needed to know how the compound behaved against an unprepared target before they used it somewhere that could shoot back. Hollowspan was the control group. We were the control group. I carried the last viable sample out of the school gymnasium, where the residue had pooled thickest along the floor seams, and I did not let myself think about why the floor seams of a gymnasium would hold concentration like that. On my way out I passed the clinic, 11 beds, all 11 occupied when the dispersal hit, according to the duty log recovered from its server rack. The server had survived. The patients hadn't. I logged the rack as evidence, not as anything else, because that was the only way I knew to carry it out the door. I sealed the case. I called it in. I went back to the transport and sat very still until the airlock cycled, and then I went to work, because work was the only room in my head with no windows looking backward. Coldspar Yard took the sample 3 days later. It was not a research station built for this. It had built engine housings and drive shielding for 40 years, but it had clean rooms and a staff that didn't ask questions they weren't cleared to ask, and Admiral Yusukurin wanted the analysis done somewhere small enough to control. I ran the molecular breakdown myself, twice, because the first pass told me something I didn't want to be true. The Cinder Draught wasn't built to kill indiscriminately. It was tuned. It read neural density and burrowed toward command cluster tissue first, the parts of a brain that organize and decide, before it touched anything else. It hadn't murdered Hollowspan. It had gone looking for whoever in a crowd was most likely to be in charge, and worked outward from there. Efficient. Curious, almost, in the way a scalpel is curious. That told us 2 things. It told us the Kallow had a use for this beyond slaughter, somewhere it would matter more precisely whom it found first. And it told me, 6 weeks into reverse engineering the compound down to its binding chemistry, exactly what to build back. We didn't talk about revenge at Coldspar Yard. Nobody used the word. We talked about calibration windows and binding site specificity and yield curves, the way you'd discuss anything else in a clean room, and underneath every conversation sat 4012 names I had typed into a database myself. Run came down to the bay every evening at the same hour and asked the same question, readiness, not vengeance, and every evening I gave her a number closer to 1. The first working analog killed every cell culture we tested it on, command tissue and otherwise, indiscriminate as the original, which meant we had built a worse version of the thing that murdered a school, and I made the team scrap 2 weeks of work rather than carry that forward. The second analog held its targeting but degraded outside lab conditions in under an hour, useless across the distance the fleet would need to cross. It took a third full pass through the binding chemistry, and a synthetic biology consult pulled from a coalition university 4 jumps away, before the compound held shape, held targeting, and held nothing else, 3 properties, finally, in the same molecule. The recoil fleet staged 1100 light-years out for the better part of 4 months while 3 of us finished the work nobody announced. We weren't building a bigger version of the Cinder Draught. We were building its opposite. Same delivery method, same molecular elegance, but retuned to bind not to command cluster neurons in a crowd of strangers, but to a specific genetic and procedural signature, the research caste administrators who had authorized the test, whose biometric data sat in the Kallow's own intercepted logs because clinical empires document everything, including themselves. Precision, not punishment by population. We were sending their own scalpel back, sharpened to find only the hands that had held it. Ren signed the final formulation herself, in the same room where I'd run the first molecular breakdown 5 months earlier, and asked me once, only once, whether I was certain of the targeting margin. I told her the margin was the whole point, that if we got it wrong, we'd be exactly what the Kallow already believed us to be, and I would rather scrap the program than ship a weapon I couldn't stand behind. She nodded, logged her authorization, and left without another word. That was the closest anyone came to ceremony. The recoil fleet crossed Kallow space without contact for 9 days, 340 hulls, no boast, no broadcast, and reached Cold Vault Prime, the Ascendancy's primary research enclave, at their dawn. Ren gave the planet's civilian population 16 hours evacuation clearance through the Kallow's own emergency channel, broadcast in their own administrative dialect so there could be no claim of confusion afterward. I watched the readiness clock from Coldspar Yard's relay feed, 4012 names still open on a second monitor, the way they had been every day for 5 months. At the 16th hour, the fleet released the compound over 3 research towers and 1 command annex, nowhere else. No farmland. No residential ring. No clinic, no school, nothing with 11 beds in it. The agent moved exactly the way I had built it to move, through ventilation, through air handling, finding its calibrated targets and nothing beyond them, leaving every uninvolved life in Cold Vault Prime standing in the street an hour later, confused and alive, wondering why the towers had gone quiet rather than why the city had gone silent. 311 Kallow administrators were confirmed in the affected zone. 311 matched the biometric signature on the authorization order for hollow span. The math came out even, in the only sense that mattered to me, not name for name, never that, but the precision matching the crime it answered, instead of matching the carelessness of it. There was no occupation. The recoil fleet held orbit 9 days to confirm no further dispersal weapon left the planet's labs, then withdrew in formation, leaving Cold Vault Prime's civilian infrastructure untouched and its research towers sealed, empty, and very clean, cleaner, in fact, than the Kallow had ever bothered to leave hollow span. On the 7th day of the hold, a junior Kallow administrator who had not been on hollow span's authorization order tried to broadcast a surrender on behalf of the research caste. Run had the message logged and not answered. There was nothing left to surrender that we wanted. We weren't there to take the planet. We were there to close one file, the same way the Kallow had closed theirs the moment they wrote suitable for dispersal efficacy measurement and moved on to the next test. I closed the database 3 weeks later. 4012 names, each one checked, each one accounted for against a response built to find only the people who had decided their deaths were acceptable data. I didn't delete the file. I never will. But the night Ren came down to tell me the count matched, I didn't feel anything close to victory. I felt the particular, exhausted quiet of a debt that had finally, exactly, come due, and I went back to the gymnasium floor seams in my head one more time, and then, for the first time in 5 months, I didn't go back to work.